This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. Today, as the title suggests, I am going to be contrasting the views of Triffin, an economist that's associated with global trade and the paradoxes of having a global reserve currency, and Ron Paul, Dr. Ron Paul. But before we jump into the scintillating material for today's episode, let me give you these announcements. Bureaucracy is both a weapon and a weakness for the modern state. As Mises warned in his book Bureaucracy, the ultimate basis of an all-around bureaucratic system is violence. And as Murray Rothbard said, what bureaucrats and power elites always want is for the opposition to shut up and go away, to obey orders, to accept their assigned tasks. Well, we here at the Mises Institute don't plan to shut up or go away. So join us on April 26th in Phoenix, Arizona, as we expose the danger and waste of bureaucracy. Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo will discuss the psychological operations in bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. Register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25. That's Mises.org/Phoenix and the numerals 25. Also, I want to thank everybody who participated in our raffle for this event. And the winner of that was Adam Denton. So he's going to be getting free tickets. And Adam, just stay tuned. You will be contacted by someone from the Institute. That's how you can claim your prize. Congratulations. Okay, so what we are talking about in this episode, folks, is all about tariffs. And in particular, I want to home in on an argument I have seen saying that, hey, if the U.S. is to maintain its global reserve currency status with the dollar, it's inevitable that we have to have perpetual trade deficits. And this economist Triffin was the one who laid this all out. And I want to say, actually, no, that's wrong. And beyond me just poking holes in others, I'm going to say what could be done, right? Because that's an issue too, is a lot of people are saying, okay, you libertarian economists who are in support of free trade, you don't like tariffs, we get it, but give us some solutions then, right? So I'm going to do that too. Also, I'm going to be playing some clips, both from President Trump and then later in the episode from Tucker Carlson recently had on Lighthouser, who was a trade representative for the U.S., and I'm going to be trying to weave this all together. I'm going to be showing lots of different charts and things. So if you're normally one who listens to this, just the audio version, this is a particular episode where you might want to put this one on pause and go get yourself in front of a computer or at least your phone or something and watch the video. One last bit of housekeeping before I jump in to the main material here. Strictly speaking, and I'm giving this as a note for purists because I know we have a lot of both PhDs and people getting their PhDs listening, and some even younger folks that are extremely attentive to detail and really want to get the facts correct. Strictly speaking, when people are talking about, hey, if a bunch of foreigners want to invest in U.S. assets, and then the accounting flip side of that is going to be goods flowing from the U.S. to the foreigners, and there's a temptation to call that a trade deficit. And so the idea is to try to explain a benign or innocuous reason that a country might have perpetual trade or big trade deficits is that, hey, we're such a haven, hot spot for capital around the world to flow to. And strictly speaking, the correct analog of a capital account surplus would be a current account deficit as opposed to a trade deficit. So just real quickly, I'll just make this point. I'm not going to belabor it, and then I'll just move on to the main material. But I did want to say this, give this subtlety at the outset, because I'm going to forget if we get into this stuff. The way to picture it is, suppose somebody in the United States saves $1 million and then lends it to somebody in Japan at 5% interest. Okay. And so then that, every year they owe $50,000 of interest to the American. The way that could look in terms of the flow of goods is the U.S. could have exported 20 cars or a bunch of bushels of wheat, to make it more accurate or realistic, to Japan. And then every year they send one modest car over to the U.S., right? So instead of the U.S. giving $1 million up front and then there's a perpetual flow of $50,000 interest payments on it, instead you could picture it as a bunch of U.S. exports up front and then a perpetual flow of Japanese imports to the U.S. on the back end. And that would not, that perpetual flow of one car per year into the U.S., even though that would show up as part of the trade deficit, right? There's every year, like, no, the U.S. is importing one car and there's no corresponding U.S. export of goods or services to show for it. That wouldn't in any way indicate, given the scenario I just painted for you, that wouldn't show that the U.S. was living above its means and was sinking deeper and deeper into debt or anything like that, or that the Japanese were somehow getting a larger and larger claim on U.S. assets, given the story I just told. All right, so that's just an example to show you there that you could have a trade deficit that doesn't mean foreigners are getting larger and larger claims on U.S. assets, given the scenario I painted there. All right, so I just want to make that little housekeeping note. Having said all that, in this episode, I'm going to use the term trade deficit as if really I should be saying the current account deficit. But anyway, so that's a little housekeeping note. Okay, big picture. What can I do to make this fun and exciting? Let's lead off, as it were, with a clip from President Trump. This is from the address he gave when he unveiled his executive order last week announcing this new regime of tariffs. So here is a clip from that.
From 1789 to 1913, we were a tariff-backed nation, and the United States was proportionately the wealthiest it has ever been. So wealthy, in fact, that in the 1880s, they established a commission to decide what they were going to do with the vast sums of money they were collecting. We were collecting so much money so fast, we didn't know what to do with it. Isn't that a nice problem to have? What do you think, Marco? Good problem? Marco would love that problem. But we don't have that problem anymore, but we're not going to have it very much longer, I will tell you. But they collected so much money, they actually formed a commission to determine what they were going to do with the money, who they were going to give it to, and how much. Then in 1913, for reasons unknown to mankind, they established the income tax so that citizens, rather than foreign countries, would start paying the money necessary to run our government. Then in 1929, it all came to a very abrupt end with the Great Depression, and it would have never happened if they had stayed with the tariff policy. It would have been a much different story.
Okay. On this podcast and elsewhere, I have given reasons, and I'll link to some of them, as to why tariffs within reason are preferable ways of raising revenue compared to an income tax. All right. So I'm not challenging what Trump said there in terms of the basic argument. However, I just want to point something out, because I think President Trump, certainly the more he speaks about this stuff, the more clear it becomes that he thinks a trade deficit per se is an indication that something's wrong. And even a trade deficit of the U.S. with some other particular country, not just the U.S. versus the world as a whole, but even a bilateral trade deficit is an indication that the U.S. is somehow getting ripped off, or the other country must be doing something unfair, or what have you. All right. So in that context, then I've been over the months trying to come up with thought experiments and appeal to history to try to get people to see that's not necessarily the case. And it occurred to me, it's staring me in the face when, once Trump made that statement about from 1789 to 1913, is if you are a MAGA fan and you really like what Trump's doing with these tariffs, and you look back fondly on that era when we had sensible tax policy and, the founding fathers and their immediate heirs built this protective tariff wall ushered in by guys like Alexander Hamilton and so on. I'm guessing you think that the U.S. ran a trade surplus in that era. and that it was only later with switching away from tariffs and into income taxes, and then later on with the, in your view, foolish, NAFTA and other kind of free trade deals that lowered tariff barriers even more, and the U.S. was being a sucker, and other countries weren't playing by the same rules or whatever. That's when the U.S. started running huge trade deficits, right? So in case that's what you think, that's why I think it's important for you to know that no. So look at this chart. You can see this is showing the U.S. trade balance, and you can see from, this chart starts in 1800 up until about 1875-ish, it was below the zero line, okay? So the U.S. ran perpetual trade deficits from its founding up until, like I say, I'm just eyeballing this chart, early 1870s, maybe 1875-ish, is when it finally flipped, and that's when the U.S. started running a trade surplus overall. And then it ran a trade surplus for a long time until the early 1970s, at which point the trade balance again went negative, such that the U.S. overall was running a trade deficit with the rest of the world, and then it just kept sinking deeper and deeper. Okay, so again, my point is, if you think the founding fathers and then the subsequent administrations had a pretty good package of economic policies, including raising revenue primarily from tariffs and not having an income tax. They briefly had one during the so-called Civil War, but not having it until 1913. And that was the period when the U.S. was just this economic powerhouse. Okay, and I'm saying that goes hand in hand with when the U.S. was running large trade deficits, right? You'll see on that chart, especially in the early years, the trade deficit is a share of the total size of the U.S. economy, from like 1800 to, well, it really kicks in around, 1805 or such for the next 15 years or so, except for a brief blip upward where it almost had balanced trade, but not quite. That was a more negative trade balance than we've even had in recent times, right? That was the, quote, worst the U.S. trade balance has ever been in U.S. history, at least, since the Constitution. I don't know what the numbers look like when the colonies were in effect. Okay. To give you a little bit more insight into what's going on here, like why did it look like that? We can decompose the overall trade balance into this sectoral components. So this chart is breaking it up in terms of manufactured goods versus raw materials. And you can see this chart starts at 1820. The other one started at 1800. So this one's a little bit further in time. But you can see that early on, the U.S. actually ran a trade surplus on raw materials. And I believe that includes agricultural goods. I didn't go and look it up. In other words, I think these two series added together is the overall trade balance in goods, but I technically didn't check that to be sure. And for sure, though, the orange line there shows manufactured goods. Okay, so you can see the U.S. had a trade surplus on raw materials, and it had a trade deficit in the early decades of its existence in manufactured goods. And then those two, they look like they're almost mirror images, but they end up being negative, right? Like if you look at it carefully, you can see the manufactured goods is more negative than the raw materials is positive. So if you add those two together, it's overall a negative net figure, and that's why I think this is the decomposition of that previous series that I showed you. Okay, so just to pause for a moment, not to get mad or angry or anything about this, but just to understand what is this? Why is this like that? It makes perfect sense, right? When it was first established, during the colonial era, and then after the Revolution, the early United States, first under the Articles of Confederation, and then, good old US of A under the Constitution, it had a lot of potential, right? It had awesome institutions, a good moral society with a firm foundation, the obvious blight of slavery, but compared to the rest of the world, very a beacon of liberty and individual freedom, right? The rule of law, all the sorts of ingredients that would go into what would eventually become an economic powerhouse. But at that time, they didn't have a lot of accumulated capital, right? That the Europeans had gone over and found largely a virgin land, and they acquired it, not always through voluntary means. But the point is, they didn't go over and find a bunch of factories and huge bustling cities that they conquered. They had to get material from Great Britain, right? And elsewhere in Europe in order to get up and running. And so what happened is, in the early years of the Republic, it made sense for capitalists to send their capital to the United States, right? To invest in the United States, because that was where the highest rate of return would be, right? If you were going to start, eventually, like, you're going to build railroads or build factories or whatever, it would make sense, other things equal, to put them in the United States rather than build another one in Europe somewhere that had already had a history of that. Okay. So that's the point I'm making here. Okay. And so it makes sense when you think of it like that, oh yeah, in the early decades, manufactured goods would flow from Europe across the ocean into the United States as it built up its potential, its capacity. And then only at some point in the future would it finally flip to where the U.S. on net was sending abroad more manufactured goods than it was importing. And that finally, you can see that flip happened, looks like 1895-ish, is when the U.S. finally on net started exporting more manufactured goods than it imported. Okay? And again, there's nothing weird about that. The analogy I came up with, or example, was, let's say Elon Musk gets his Martian colony up and running. If you viewed that as a separate country, or whatever you viewed it as, we just applied the standard trade accounting and treated it as a separate jurisdiction, clearly the Mars colony would run a massive trade deficit with planet Earth during the first decade, at least, of its existence, probably more than the first decade, right? Just because a bunch of material from Earth would have to go to Mars to get them up and running before, they could be producing things on Mars. And that would include tourism, right? That's the way these trade statistics work, right? So if partly what they did on Mars was just build hotels and things, and hey, come to Mars and observatories, and you can go look out at the stars on a telescope on Mars, and you can jump around and play basketball, and you can jam and stuff, even if you're not you don't have big calves because the gravity there is weaker, and and sure, that's great. And that would be in the trade statistics. That would, if Earthlings visited the Martian colony and spent money there as tourists, that would show up as Mars exporting tourism services to Earthlings. Okay. But still, to get that up and running, you would need a bunch of material from Earth to flow to Mars first, so they could build the hotels and they could build the basketball courts and the telescope observatories and whatnot. Okay. It's not like there's a bunch of forest land that the early settlers on Mars could just go chop down and build the hotels with. Okay. So I belabored the point enough, but I wanted to stretch it. And so also, partly I wanted to cover this because if we go back to the first chart I showed you that just shows the overall trade balance, one of the main points I've been hammering here on the Human Action Podcast and others over the last several months in particular is that I think both sides commit a mistake here when they talk about trade deficits, that the Trump fans in general think a trade deficit is bad, that's a signal that your country's getting ripped off, or that at least your people are doing something irresponsible. Whereas a lot of libertarian trained economists, or just people who read a lot of economics works, in my view, a lot of times commit the opposite mistake, including people like Milton Friedman. On this podcast, I've played you guys clips from Friedman where he just says things that are demonstrably wrong, where the pendulum swung too much the other way, where in their zeal to diffuse common protectionist fallacies, a lot of these free trade economists go too far the other way and end up saying that a trade deficit is per se a sign of economic health. And I would say, no, it doesn't need to be. It could be, but it could also be a sign of economic weakness. All right. And so I think the U.S. is a great example of both. That this chart that I'm showing you here, which again is the overall goods trade balance of the U.S. is a share of the total economy. I would say in that early period, Trump is right. That's a great example of a healthy, productive U.S. economy that certainly was growing at a fast clip. Standards of living were rising rapidly and so on. And yet they had a big trade deficit. And why? I would say because the U.S. was a magnet for international investment at that point. And so in terms of, loosely put, if investors around the world want to sink a bunch of capital and gain ownership of U.S.-based assets, how do they pay for it? Well, they got to ship you goods now. Like, why would the people in the U.S. be willing to sell claims on future U.S.-generated income? Well, you got to give me something now for it. Oh, why don't you give me a bunch of manufactured goods that you can make in London more cheaply than we can make here in Philadelphia, right? So that's the way that worked. So the trade deficits of the U.S. in the early years, to me, are a signal that, oh yeah, this is investors around the world think this is a great place to invest. And so it's a sign of its strength. Whereas a growing trade deficit could also be symptomatic of a country where, for example, the people and the government are profligate and they're running up massive debts that aren't productive, right? That it's not like a company issuing shares of stock or floating new bonds to raise funds to go build more factories because they just anticipate such growing demand for their product. But no, it's more like people going on a vacation and running up the credit card, right? So both of those scenarios are consistent with someone importing more goods than they sell and giving up ownership to outside investors as the way to pay for it. But if it's a company that's issuing debt or equity in order to expand its future capacity, you could say, well, that's a sign of its strength. Like that's not alarming. Whereas again, if it's people just run up credit cards to go pay for a vacation, maybe they can afford it and it's fine, but it could be, that's not sustainable. You can't keep doing that. Okay. So I think, like I say, historically, the U.S. in the different periods where it had massive trade deficits from 1800 to, 1860, whatever. And then it started going balanced. And then from the 1970s forward, those are two different periods where the trade deficit was on the one hand a sign of economic strength and on the other hand a sign of stagnation and cause for alarm. Okay. Let me now talk about this economist Triffin, and the way I'll motivate this discussion, I'm reading here from, and of course, folks, I'll link to all this stuff. But this is from John Malden. This was March 28th of 2025. Somebody sent me this and said, hey, Bob, this is really interesting. I'd like to get your thoughts. And so I thought, okay, I can work this all into this grand human action episode that you're experiencing as we speak. So this guy, I've heard of him before. It's Malden Economics. And anyway, it's a very detailed, it's the kind of thing where, investors might subscribe to this guy's newsletter or whatnot, I think. But in any event, this is an unguarded post here that we have access to. And he's got a section in this. So his big picture is he's not a fan of what Trump's doing. And he thinks the MAGA concern with trade deficits for the U.S. is misguided, because he thinks, given that the U.S. has the U.S. dollar, and if you want that to remain the global reserve currency, you got to be willing to tolerate trade deficits, and like it's silly for you to want one but not the other, right? So here I'm going to read from his post because this will motivate everything. All right, so this is Malden. He says, summarizing from Investopedia, which is the best summary of a complex subject, and so now here he's quoting from Investopedia. In October 1959, a Yale professor sat in front of Congress's Joint Economic Committee and calmly announced that the Bretton Woods system was doomed. The dollar could not survive as the world's reserve currency without requiring the United States to run ever-growing deficits. This dismal scientist was Belgian-born Robert Triffin, and he was right. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, and today the dollar's role as the reserve currency has the United States running the largest current account deficit in the world. Okay? And then you'll notice there, they said the more accurate and relevant current account deficit as opposed to trade deficit. Anyway. So now we're back. So that's the end of the quote from Investopedia. Now Malden's talking again. Triffin also predicted the collapse of the gold system. He missed a few other things, but in general, he was right. So here we go. If you have the privilege of being the world's reserve currency and you really, really, really want to keep that privilege, you must do what my friend Paul McCulley says. Act responsibly irresponsible. You must inject your currency into the global system at size. Today, that means many trillions of dollars. You are required to run a deficit. The simple fact is that if we stop running deficits, we will eventually lose the ability to be the world's reserve currency. That's math, not policy. Okay? And so I want to say that is wrong. And I'm partly harping on this, not to pick on Malden, but I've seen a lot of colleagues on social media and whatnot running with this, and they, refer matter of fact, Triffin's dilemma. Come on, just sort of rolling their eyes that I can't even have a conversation with these people that want to get rid of trade deficits if they don't realize, okay, we can do that, but then that means the dollar can't be the global reserve currency. Are you prepared to take that step? Because as Robert Triffin showed back and I want to say, no, that's wrong. And what's also interesting, just as a side note, how this guy Malden is alluding to his friend Paul McCulley, who says the only thing we can do if you want to keep the dollar as a world reserve currency is to act responsibly irresponsible. And the reason this is ironic is because, number one, I disagree with it, but also you may remember, wait, that Paul McCulley, that sounds familiar. So he's this guy from PIMCO, and you may remember if you are a Contra Krugman aficionado, right? If you listen to the podcast that Tom Woods and I had where we weekly took on the op-ed from Paul Krugman, one of the big albatrosses around Krugman's neck was that in 2002, he had written an article where he said Alan Greenspan to snap out of these doldrums because there was the recession that kicked in 2001. And he said Alan Greenspan needs to replace the collapsing NASDAQ bubble with a housing bubble. And then if you go and read specifically what Krugman said back, and so obviously after the housing bubble collapsed, people went and found that and said, oh yeah, good call, Krugman. And so if you go and read it, what he actually said was, Krugman gave his analysis and then said, and as Paul McCulley says, the only way Greenspan can get us out of this, these doldrums and to get healthy growth again is to replace the NASDAQ bubble with a housing bubble. So later on, when Krugman was trying to avoid shame for having written that, he was just throwing McCulley under the bus and just saying, no, I wasn't endorsing him. I was just saying that's what he says. Right? And so anyway, I thought Krugman was being slippery because in context, he's clearly endorsing the sentiment, but whatever. You don't need to take a stand on them. I'm just saying these are now 2 episodes where people have said, as Paul McCulley says, and in both cases, I think Paul McCulley's given horrible advice. Okay, so back to the matter at hand. Is it in fact true? Is this guy Triffin correct that if the U.S. dollar is to remain the world's reserve currency, that means the United States has to run current account deficits or trade deficits with the rest of the world perpetually, and that they have to get bigger and bigger in dollar terms over time to keep feeding the global appetite, And so the intuition here, just so you understand where these people are coming from and why it's superficially it sounds correct. The idea is, yeah, if you just have a regular country and your currency is not the global reserve currency, well then, yeah, if you keep running trade deficits and your people are buying more imports than exports, there's a sense in which your currency, you keep flooding the world with your currency, and foreigners don't want to hold your currency, right? Like if you're Japan, it's not that people around the world want to keep loading up on yen, and they don't even really want to keep loading up on Japanese government debt. And so eventually, they can't do that too much. And so then the idea is if they keep printing a bunch of yen and their people keep importing more than Japan exports, and so in a sense, yen is flowing out, eventually that's going to come back. And so their currency is going to weaken. The yen will fall against other currencies if that process continues, until the point at which Japanese exports are really cheap because the yen has fallen so much against other currencies. And so then foreigners on the margin will start switching over and saying, oh, instead of buying local, let's import from Japan because look at how cheap Japanese cars are because the yen has fallen so much against our currency, right? And so there's like a self-reversing mechanism. If you're a student of the history of economic thought, this David Hume had this famous essay where it's now called Hume's price specie flow mechanism, right? So just imagine the whole world just uses gold coins as the money. And so the idea is if one country just keeps importing more than they export and everybody just uses gold coins as the money, well, then that country it's running out of gold, right? Gold on net is flowing out of it year after year because, again, they're spending more on imports than there's earning in sales of exports. And so how are they paying for it? Well, gold coins must be flowing out. And so the idea is the prices of their goods quoted in gold, like ounces of gold, are going to eventually start going down as their people are just literally running out of gold coins. They can't, they don't have enough gold coins now to buy from their local merchants, so prices have to fall until the point at which the rest of the world's going to start buying their stuff. And then gold will flow back into the country. Okay, so there's that self-reversing mechanism, and that's true even in a world of fiat monies issued by sovereign governments where you have floating exchange rates. And the idea is if one country, if their central bank's just printing up a bunch of their currency, they can have in the short term trade deficits and their people are just going out and spending their stuff and bringing in more imports. But the idea is eventually their currency is going to fall so much against other currencies that it'll self-reverse. And you might have a period of trade deficits, but then that should be followed by a period of trade surpluses. And in the long run, it should all balance out. That's the idea. And so, but wait a minute. There's a giant asterisk, the argument goes, if you have the global reserve currency, because now, let's say it's the US, and if they're printing dollars and then Americans are able to buy more from foreigners than vice versa in terms of goods and services, so that the US is running trade deficits, the normal mechanism doesn't kick in that would self-reverse that. Because foreigners, if the US dollar is the global reserve currency, are happy to stockpile, literally foreigners might hold $100 bills, particularly in countries like that might be having hyperinflation. The people there might literally use Benjamins as a means of payment or just, as a store of wealth or something. But more generally, countries might have U.S. treasuries, for example, as reserves. All right, and that's a very safe asset to stockpile. Okay, so the point is, you could think of it like as the U.S. exporting dollars. And if you do that, then you can say, oh, there's no reason, even in the long run, so long as the U.S. government doesn't overdo it, and doesn't print so much that foreigners get leery and, they're worried the dollar's going to crash or something. But in general, if the rest of the globe is willing to absorb excess dollar creation, you can see how the U.S. could get away with running massive trade deficits for decades. And it wouldn't, come back to bite them. All right. So that's the argument. And so a lot of people, seeing somebody lay it out like the way I just did, understandably conclude, and they say, oh, sometimes it's called like the exorbitant privilege. You might have heard that phrase. And so they understandably conclude and say, oh, the massive or the chronic U.S. trade deficits of the last few decades are not an indication that something's wrong or that, these imbalances are building up and, oh man, we got to get ready because the dam's going to burst pretty soon. They say, no, that's the natural outcome of the U.S. being the best currency in the world. All right. Whether you think we achieved that fairly or because of blowing up Hiroshima or whatever, Whatever the explanation is, you could say that's the natural outcome. Okay. So I want to say that is actually not correct. So number one, note the irony that in October of 1959, the Yale professor was saying this is unsustainable, that you have to run continued trade surpluses, and they didn't run trade surpluses or trade deficits. I meant to say the other way around. So here, let me show you. You already know this because of the earlier charts, but this is a cleaner one from Fred, the St. Louis Federal Reserve. This is a prettier chart. So this is showing. These are annual figures. This is from 1929 through 2024, the latest, data point annual that we have. And this is the net exports of goods and services share of GDP. Okay, so if it's above that horizontal black line, that means the U.S. had a trade surplus that year. And if it's below, that means the U.S. had a trade deficit that year. Okay, so in this time interval, you can see this lines up with the other chart I showed you before. You can see from 1929 up until the early 70s, the U.S., it bounced around, but it went from being roughly balanced trade to the U.S. having a modest surplus. And it had a real big surplus right after World War II ended, where the U.S. trade surplus got up to about 4.5% of GDP, briefly. All right. And then the only major trade deficit occurred at the height of World War II, where the trade deficit, and I can't tell if that's 33 or 34 or 43 or 44, but the U.S. trade deficit in that year was a little bit deeper than negative 1%. Okay, so it's weird that in 1959, Triffin is telling everybody, "Oh, the only way the Bretton Woods system works is if the U.S. is willing to tolerate ever-growing trade deficits." When up till that point, since Bretton Woods had been established, the U.S. did nothing but have balanced trade or surpluses ranging from modest to huge, right? So that's kind of weird. And then also, after he was done testifying, another decade passed where the U.S. continued to run modest trade surpluses, right? So it's kind of weird that happened. That Triffin is credited as being this prophet when what he said was wrong when he said it, and it continued to be wrong for another 10 years. And you only see it come true when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, right? So it's a bit weird that, again, the conventional narrative is, and I should say, I did not go back. I started to actually look at his congressional testimony, but it was real specific about gold reserves, and it was the Bretton Woods framework, and that's not what we're talking about now. It's not completely relevant. So in fairness, it might be that Triffin's analysis was very nuanced, but really what I'm saying is the way people nowadays play Triffin like a trump card, no pun intended with Trump's name, that's incorrect. Okay, so maybe his own testimony was more nuanced, but I'm saying like the Investopedia summary there of what it said, he said, that's wrong, clearly wrong, right? That you can see while the Bretton Woods system was in operation, the U.S. either ran balanced or trade surpluses, and it was only when they finally abandoned the system and went full fiat that you all of a sudden had these chronic trade deficits kick in. Okay. And as theoretically, the point is, like, what's wrong theoretically with this point, besides me just appealing to empirics here, is that it's true if you want the US dollar to continue to be the global reserve currency, you have to allow for foreign institutions to accumulate a larger and larger stockpile of US dollar denominated assets, whether that's literal reserves like, balances held with the Federal Reserve Bank itself, or US Treasury debt. Okay. But that is not the same thing as saying, therefore, the U.S. has to run bigger and bigger trade deficits. All right. So, for example, So just go back to the intuition of the U.S. is exporting dollars. You can think of it that way, but everyone just assumed that, oh, so if we're just going to, let's say the rest of the world wants to add $1 trillion in the year 2026, the rest of the world wants to add $1 trillion of U.S. reserves to their balance sheets. And that can include central banks and, big corporations and whatnot, as well as, maybe drug dealers in Latin America want to carry around more $100 bills. Okay. So yes, you could say the U.S. government needs to issue $1 trillion more of treasury debt that gets held abroad. And that's fine. The mistake is thinking, and the way the foreigners pay for that is by sending us $1 trillion worth of goodies, like, cars and flat screen TVs and sweaters and sneakers and iPhones, right? It doesn't have to be like that. The accounting is still consistent with the U.S. exports $1 trillion worth of USD assets, and foreigners send us $1 trillion worth of their assets, right? So the U.S. could be acquiring Australian real estate and shares of equity in Japanese companies and bonds issued by the German government, right? The accounting is still consistent with that. So just because, again, just to make the point, even if you stipulate that the rest of the world wants to acquire U.S. dollar denominated assets, they don't have to pay for them with goods that they export to us and that we import, right? The accounting is consistent with them giving us shares of, or, claims on their assets. Okay. So that's, I think, the fundamental problem with people citing Triffin's dilemma is it's not literally true. And also empirically, or I guess one way of putting it is it's wrong in both theory and history. That I've just showed you theoretically why, no, you could still have a country issuing the global reserve currency and its people would not have to run massive trade deficits. And I'm showing you that it wasn't the case under Bretton Woods. The U.S. did not, in fact, run trade deficits. It ran trade surpluses that whole period. Or, some years it was close to balanced. Okay. Let me now, as I explained before, I want to contrast what I view as Triffin's wrong view, or at least what people commonly describe as, oh, this is the views of Triffin and what the Triffin dilemma was, with Ron Paul. So Ron Paul famously got into politics when Richard Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. And so I just showed you with that Fred chart of the U.S. balance of trade, the U.S. from 29 forward typically ran trade surpluses, or it was close to balanced, except for like 2 years. And then it flipped in the early 70s. And let me show you two other charts, right? So the right-wing MAGA fans, they don't like the fact that the U.S. all of a sudden, for some reason, started running chronic trade deficits. And let me also now address the concerns of left-wing progressives. So a big complaint they have is income inequality. So let me show you this chart. This is from a book by, or a chapter from Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, right? So they are two of the leading academics in the inequality literature, right? So they have co-authored stuff with Thomas Piketty. You may have heard of him, all right? But Saez and Zuckman are, I think, probably the undisputed heroes of those who think wealth and income inequality have gotten a lot worse with the rise of what they might call neoliberalism. And, they've done all the empirical work on this stuff. They're the leaders in this area. All right. So their own chart here, this is showing share of income earned by the top 1%. And this is for the US. And actually this chart is from, they're reproducing it from Piketty and Saez, as I'm just reading this description. And so you can see, and this is typically shown to indicate how things really got bad under the Reagan administration, right? And the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism in the early 80s. And look at how bad this is, deregulation and weakening of workers' bargaining power, right? I'm sure you've heard these narratives. And this is supposed to show proof of it, right? And you'd see, oh yeah, from 1910, the share of the income earned by the top 1% was in the 20% and it bounced around. And then, oh, look at the decline during the post-war era, where it kept sinking down and down. And then for some reason it troughed and then started marching back up. And now we're getting back to the Gilded Age era, levels of inequality. I'm sure you've heard stuff like that. And typically the way that's presented, as I said, is, oh, we had, the New Deal came in the 30s and aggressive pro-worker legislation and regulation and Social Security and Medicare and stuff like that, or Medicare and under LBJ, and the war on poverty, things like this. And then that was all turned around under Thatcher and Reagan. But if you look at that chart, you can see it doesn't turn around in 1981. No, it troughs in the early 70s, and then it starts going upward. All right, let me show you a different chart. This one is from the EPI, Economic Policy Institute, and you may have seen this diagram. This is a famous in economic policy wonk circles, just showing this alleged disconnect between productivity and a typical worker's compensation, right? And they have these charts showing, oh, you see from this one I'm showing, 1948 to the certain cutoff era, you see those lines move in lockstep. And the light blue line is hourly compensation. The dark blue line is a measure of worker productivity. And they seem to go up hand in hand. Oh yeah, it makes sense. As workers become more productive, they get paid more. Up, and then there's that dotted line. And then from that point forward, you can see worker productivity keeps going up, but yet hourly compensation, and that's in real terms, flatlines. It actually drops a little bit and it only starts going up later on, such that there's this huge gap that emerges over the last few decades between worker productivity and their hourly compensation. And again, if you get into this literature, you're going to see people talking about Ronald Reagan's tax cuts, and there's deregulation and taking away workers' rights, and the decline of union membership, stuff like that. It's very left-wingy pet issues. Okay, but what is interesting is their own chart shows the point they picked at when this divergence started occurring was 1973. Ronald Reagan was not in office in 1973. Okay, and so my point with this stuff is, it seems like the right-wing MAGA fans say something screwy really started happening with the U.S. economy in the early 1970s, and the left-wing pro-worker people also are complaining about, seems like things were going great until, what was it that happened in the early 1970s? That there's this big structural shift in the economy. Oh, Richard Nixon finally unshackled the dollar from gold. And that's when the Federal Reserve could really begin printing money like crazy. I just did some quick calculations. So using the government's own consumer price index, I broke it up into decades here. From 1950 to 1960, CPI went up an average of 2.3% annually. And that's from January to January. From January 1960 to January of 1970, it went up 2.6% annually. Okay, so again, during the 50s, it was 2.3%. During the 60s, it was 2.6%. And then from January of 1970 through January of 1980, the average annualized growth rate was 7.5%. And then from 80 to 90, it had dropped down to 5.0%. Okay, so the 2 decades before Nixon went off, the average growth in the consumer price index, again, using their official numbers, was 2.3%, and then 2.6%, and then it jumped up to 7.5%. And then after the heroic Paul Volcker came in and broke the back of inflation, it was down to an annualized 5.0% during the 1980s. Okay, so this isn't mysterious when you take away the last vestiges of the gold standard, because what Richard Nixon killed in 1971 was a very weak, patient in the intensive care unit version of what used to be the classical gold standard before World War I. Okay. But still, that was the last check on what the Federal Reserve could do in terms of the printing press. And then Nixon closed that. And then you saw what happened. All right. So my point is, Ron Paul is right. And I think economists sometimes, even those of us who are hard money types, don't fully appreciate and don't believe in our bones just how disastrous that was. That the U.S. government doing that. And just, think of the people in Washington, and they're with a lot of our perspectives on this stuff, that they destroy, the family, and they've wrecked the inner city. They've bombed foreign countries to oblivion. And then the idea like, and I know, let's give this same group of people a printing press. Like, look at what they've done with education. Surely giving them a printing press, they could be trusted with that. And no, they can't. Okay. And so I'm saying all these problems are flowing from that fateful decision. Incidentally, before I forget, if you try to Google and look up that EPI chart, the divergence between productivity and a typical worker's compensation, you may find charts that look like the one I just flashed for you a minute ago, but where they have the cutoff in 1979. And you might say, what the heck, Bob? Are you lying to me? I don't have time to get into it now because it would take us too far afield. I put a link, though, if you're curious, or you may have remembered this if you saw it when it happened. Jonathan Newman and I went through this episode. What happened was the original EPI charts were all showing the divergence happened in 1973. And then after, they amended it. So like the next time they updated their, this study that they do, they moved it to make the divergence happen in 1979. And it's not because on the basis of new data, they realized, oh no, a more logical inflection point. No, the underlying data is the same for those years. That it makes sense. The divergence happens in 73. And they just moved that dotted line to 79 and redid the numbers, but using their own data and the things they're showing, even with their own numbers, it would make more sense to put that back in 1973. I can't prove this. My guess is what happened is the people who put this study out saw that guys like me, I'm not saying me in particular, but guys like me were pointing to this and saying, okay, yeah, good point, guys. I agree. Something screwy happened in 1973. That was the big recession that happened after Nixon went off gold. And now workers had to suffer from rampant inflation, and that their nominal wages did not keep up with consumer price inflation that was, ripping loose. And that's why you saw real hourly compensation stagnate, is because Nixon unleashed inflation. And then who do you think is going to benefit during inflationary boom? It's not factory workers. It's the fat cats on Wall Street. And also that, I didn't make this connection, but that's why I think the income concentration or the inequality stats turned around in the early 70s or mid 70s, right? That makes sense, that who is going to be able to navigate the choppy financial waters more ably? Is it the top 1% who are going to be able to make sure they're in the right mix of assets so that when inflation hits, they do okay? Or is it the factory worker or the school teacher who's going to be able to have their real income, inflation adjusted income, keep rising in an inflationary environment that a lot of people didn't see coming? Well, I think that question answers itself. Okay. But anyway, I'm saying my hypothesis is the reason the EPI people, if you go and look this up, the current versions of this study where they show this pay productivity disconnect have the inflection point happening in 79 is they want to blame it on Reagan. That's what I think happened. And so they just moved it. And so anyway, if you want to see the decomposition of that, you can go to the article or the Human Action episode I'll put in the show notes page here. So all this is to say that there's a lot of screwy things that happened in the U.S. economy in the early to mid 1970s. And I want to say that's not a coincidence. a big thing was Richard Nixon going off the gold standard. And I think even a lot of free market economists don't fully appreciate that. And on this like EPI study, the main thing that my free market buddies, particularly trained economists, do when they get presented with that is they get all huffy about, oh, you're not measuring compensation right. And there's all these, fringe benefits and stuff like that, this hourly compensation figure they're using is just a straight salary. And it doesn't include all these other things, which, okay, fine. But my point is they were using a consistent method and that those two lines tracked very well for the first few decades. And then there was this huge divergence. Okay. And even if you want to say, well, yeah, for some structural reason, employers shifted from doing pay hikes to offering health care and whatever more in the mid 1970s forward than they did before. Still, why did they do that? Right. And I would say it's because maybe there was more uncertainty. And then when employees realized, geez, we want the employer to offer these other things in addition to just flat pay. Okay. So anyway, I'm just explaining those nuances. Okay. In the remaining time we have for this episode, let me now play for you a clip from Tucker Carlson recently had on Lighthizer. I think his first name's Robert, but I forgot to look that up. I think it's Robert Lighthizer, who is the former U.S. trade ambassador, I think is the term. So this guy's been around, he's a very sharp guy. Let me just play this brief clip for you, and then I will comment on it.
There's a data point called the international investment position of a country. And that is how much, for us, all Americans own throughout the entire world versus how much everyone else owns here. That number is a negative $23.5 trillion. And if you said, what was it 20 years ago? It was probably a negative $3 trillion. So we have transferred about $20 trillion worth of our national wealth, and I would say the future income of that wealth, overseas in return for current consumption.
Can you explain that measurement one more time? It's what we own here versus what others own here?
So it's how much Americans own overseas.
Okay.
All over the world. Versus how much everybody else in the world owns here. And it's a real calculation. It's not something I did, right? It's a real statistic. It's been around forever.
Okay, so first, let me show you this chart. So this is the net international investment position. And you can see that going back to the early, mid 1970s, it was basically close to zero. So again, what that is showing is you add up Americans, how much do they own of foreign assets? And then you look at foreigners, how much do they own of American assets? And that's the first minus the second. So if it's zero, that means it's roughly balanced. And then you can see it starts going negative in the mid 90s, and then it just falls off a cliff as we get out, into the 2010s and going forward, such that as of this chart, it's like negative 26 or $27 trillion. Okay. And Lighthizer is saying that is like a transfer of wealth, that foreigners have increased their claims on U.S. assets on net, over and above what Americans have claims on foreign assets by $27 trillion since like the mid 90s. Okay. Or when he said in that clip, like 20 trillion if you start in the 2000s or something. Okay. Right? That's correct. And now let me show you another interesting addition to this chart. Here, I'm just adding the gross U.S. government federal debt over that same period. And you can see they're not literally mirror images. The U.S. government debt is higher than the negative net international investment position, but you can see they're pretty similar in terms of the contours. And so here I'm trying to now summarize it all together and say, I think what happened is when Nixon finally closed the gold window in 71, that opened the floodgates. The Federal Reserve started printing money like crazy to help fuel U.S. government deficit spending. So that's what allowed the U.S. government to run chronic budget deficits, whereas the gold standard would have kept them more honest. The gold standard doesn't make it so you have to run a balanced budget, but you can't just let the debt explode. All right, that the U.S. government, for example, ran a big budget deficit during World War II, but then actually had a period where it was literally running surpluses. And then even though the government had modest budget deficits for much of the 50s and the 60s, it was smaller than the growth rate of the economy, right? So the total outstanding government debt as a share of GDP was still shrinking through the 50s and the 60s. Okay, so the U.S. was outgrowing its debt under Bretton Woods, when, they still technically, foreign central banks could turn in dollars in exchange for gold, right? And then it was after Nixon said, no, dollars don't get you anything. We're not redeeming dollars for gold anymore, that now the U.S. government could run massive budget deficits such that the debt was increasing not only in nominal terms, but also as a share of the economy. And it's, getting to the point where it's just about where it was at the peak of World War II, and the CBO projections was going to keep growing without any end in sight. Okay, so in terms of the international accounting, is the U.S. government runs up this massive debt, that goes hand in hand with Americans becoming, in a sense, more indebted to the rest of the world. And that also goes hand in hand with the rest of the world sending us a bunch of goods in exchange for claims on our future assets. So I'm saying this story all fits together, all these different patterns, okay? And so final point I'll make here is when people say, oh, okay, you pointed this stuff out, what should we do? Well, rather than enacting a bunch of tariffs, which if the underlying problem is how much debt the U.S. government's piling up, tariffs per se aren't going to fix that, right? That might just restrict the flow of trade both ways, right? That if you, other things equal, imposing a tariff makes your currency stronger. So it makes it harder for your exporters to export. So yeah, a tariff will reduce imports, but it also is going to reduce exports. So it's not even obvious that it's going to have that big of an impact on the trade balance anyway. But so I'm saying, instead of doing that or doing the 4D chess of, oh, no, Trump's just trying to scare everybody and eventually we're going to have lower tariffs all around, okay, you can try that. But my point is, what for sure will work is if the Trump administration focused on cutting spending and also returning to hard money or sound money. I'm not saying you literally need to go back on the gold standard, that I don't think they would stick to it anyway, but certainly getting the Federal Reserve to adopt a hard money stance, or in a better scenario, to get rid of the Federal Reserve altogether and to massively cut government spending so that you could reduce these massive budget deficits, that would in and of itself translate into an improving so-called trade balance. And that would, if the U.S. government cut $2 trillion of spending this year and balanced the budget and then went forward and just had a balanced budget going forward, you would see a collapse of the trade deficit, even without tariffs or anything. All right. And so my point is, since that all lines up with the Doge philosophy anyway, instead of expending political capital on these massive tariff hikes that are based on goofy formulas about trade deficits and things that don't even line up with what the rhetoric is, why don't you instead just focus on the stuff that your base really wants, and that will also have spillover benefits of these other things you care about too. All right, so I'll stop there. Big picture, Triffin's wrong, Ron Paul's right. Thanks for your attention, everybody. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.